Picture this. The year is 1944. D-Day. The beaches of Normandy are about to witness one of history's bloodiest invasions. Thousands of soldiers prepare to storm enemy fortifications, but among them, barely noticed in the chaos, are others. They don't carry rifles, they don't wear helmets. Some have 4 legs, some have wings, some are so small you could hold them in your palm. Yet without them, the entire operation might have failed. We think we know World War II. We've seen the documentaries, read the books, heard the stories of human courage and sacrifice. But there's another story, one that's been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the human narrative. It's the story of the animals who fought, bled, and died alongside soldiers. Animals who saved thousands of lives, animals who carried messages that changed the course of battles, animals who showed loyalty beyond anything we could imagine. This isn't some heartwarming tale about pets left behind during wartime. This is about warriors, strategic assets, living, breathing pieces of military technology that couldn't be replaced by any machine of the era. From the skies above Europe to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen Russian steppes to the Pacific Islands, animals were everywhere, and their contributions were extraordinary. What if I told you that a pigeon once saved nearly 200 men from certain death, that dogs were trained to find wounded soldiers in no man's land, crawling through gunfire that would make hardened veterans freeze in terror, that there was a serious military program to guide missiles using birds? You'd probably think I was exaggerating, but every word is documented fact. The scale of animal involvement in World War II is staggering. Britain alone deployed over 250,000 pigeons during the conflict. The Soviet Union used thousands upon thousands of dogs, some in ways so controversial they remain debated to this day. Horses, despite the war's mechanization, still numbered in the millions across various theaters. Elephants hauled supplies through terrain where vehicles couldn't venture. Even insects played their part in ways you'd never imagine. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. These weren't just animals being used as simple beasts of burden. Many were highly trained specialists capable of performing tasks that no human could accomplish. A pigeon could fly through conditions that would ground any aircraft. A dog's nose could detect a wounded soldier buried under rubble when all hope seemed lost. These abilities weren't just useful, they were irreplaceable. Think about the technology of the 1940s. No GPS, no satellite communications, no drones. Radio equipment was bulky, unreliable, and easily intercepted. When you needed to get a message through enemy territory, when soldiers were cut off from their units, when reconnaissance was impossible by conventional means, you turned to animals. They weren't a backup plan, they were often the only plan. The military establishments of the era understood this better than we give them credit for. Entire divisions were dedicated to training and deploying animals. Scientists studied their capabilities. Handlers formed bonds that rivaled any human friendship. This was sophisticated, organized, and absolutely essential to the war effort. Yet today, most people have no idea this happened. Ask someone about World War II animals and they might mention cavalry horses or maybe a regimental mascot. But the full scope, the incredible stories of individual animal heroes, the innovative, sometimes bizarre ways animals were integrated into military operations, that knowledge has faded from popular consciousness. Let's start with dogs because their story encompasses everything from heartbreaking loyalty to controversial ethics, from remarkable success to tragic failure. Dogs had been used in warfare before, of course, but World War II saw their deployment reach unprecedented levels of sophistication and scale. The United States Army launched its K-9 Corps program, recruiting family pets for military service. Imagine the scene. Families across America answering the call to donate their beloved companions to the war effort. Dogs that had spent their lives as house pets suddenly found themselves in training camps, learning skills that would save lives halfway around the world. These weren't just guard dogs or mascots, these were specialists. Messenger dogs learned to navigate between units, carrying orders and intelligence through conditions where radio was impossible, and human runners faced near certain death. They were small, fast, and motivated by the simple desire to reach their handler on the other side. A good messenger dog could cross several miles of active battlefield, dodging artillery, weaving through barbed wire, operating under cover of darkness or smoke. But that was just the beginning. The messenger dogs, incredible as they were, weren't even the most remarkable canine specialists. There were others whose skills bordered on miraculous. If you're finding these stories as incredible as I am, hit that like button, because what comes next will completely change how you think about courage. Casualty dogs, also called mercy dogs or medical dogs, performed one of the war's most dangerous tasks. They were trained to search battlefields for wounded soldiers, not the obvious casualties, the ones crying out for help, but the ones who couldn't call for help anymore. Soldiers who'd been knocked unconscious, buried partially by explosions, or too weak to make noise. These dogs would venture into areas still under fire, areas where medics couldn't yet safely operate, and find men who would otherwise die unnoticed. Here's how it worked. The dogs carried medical supplies in special packs, usually morphine and bandages. When they found a wounded soldier, they'd been trained to lie down beside him, providing comfort and warmth. If the soldier was conscious enough, he could use the supplies the dog carried, but even if he wasn't, the dog would return to its handler, indicating through trained behaviors that it had found someone and roughly where. Then human medics, guided by the dog's information, could mount a rescue operation. The success rate was extraordinary. These dogs found soldiers that human searchers would have walked right past. Their hearing could detect shallow breathing under the sounds of battle. Their sense of smell could locate someone buried under debris. And perhaps most importantly, they showed a discrimination that saved resources. They learned to distinguish between men who were merely wounded and men who were beyond help, focusing rescue efforts where they could make a difference. One British dog named Rob made over 20 parachute jumps during the war. Yes, parachute jumps. Dogs were trained to jump with airborne units, then assist in operations behind enemy lines. Rob participated in actions across North Africa and Italy, facing the same dangers as his human companions. He survived the war and was awarded the Dickin Medal, Britain's highest honour for animal valour. Now we need to talk about something darker. The Soviet Union, facing desperate circumstances during the Nazi invasion, developed a program that remains controversial to this day: anti-tank dogs. The concept was brutally simple. Dogs were trained to run under tanks while carrying explosives. A trigger mechanism designed to detonate when pressed against the tank's underside would destroy the vehicle. In theory, this was a cheap, effective anti-armor weapon for an army facing vastly superior German tank forces. In practice, it was a disaster on multiple levels. The dogs were trained using Soviet tanks which ran on diesel. German tanks used gasoline. The dogs, confused by the different smell, often ran under Soviet tanks instead of enemy ones. In the chaos of battle, many dogs became frightened and ran back to their trainers, still carrying live explosives. Others simply refused to approach the loud, terrifying tanks in combat conditions, no matter what their training had been. The program was eventually abandoned, but not before hundreds, possibly thousands of dogs died, often accomplishing nothing. It stands as one of the war's most ethically questionable animal programs, a reminder that not every military innovation was justified or successful. The dogs trained for this purpose had no choice, no understanding of what they were being asked to do. They trusted their human handlers completely, and that trust was exploited in the cruelest possible way. But let's shift gears, because not all canine stories ended in tragedy. Scout dogs and sentry dogs served with distinction in every theater, particularly in the Pacific. In the dense jungles of islands like Guadalcanal and Bougainville, American forces faced an enemy expert in ambush and camouflage. Japanese soldiers could remain motionless for hours, perfectly hidden, waiting to strike. Human scouts, no matter how experienced, were constantly vulnerable. But dogs changed that equation. A well-trained scout dog could detect enemy soldiers long before any human sensed their presence. They could smell them, hear them, sense their presence through means we still don't fully understand. When a scout dog alerted, indicating danger ahead, American patrols could prepare, call for support, or choose alternate routes. It's estimated that scout dogs in the Pacific saved thousands of American lives by preventing ambushes. These weren't attacks dogs or aggressive animals. Most were gentle by nature, trained to alert silently, to indicate rather than confront. Their handlers learned to read subtle cues, changes in body language that meant danger ahead. The bond between handler and dog became legendary. Men who'd survived the war would speak more emotionally about their dogs than about almost anything else they'd experienced. If dogs were impressive, pigeons were nothing short of miraculous. These birds, often dismissed as urban pests today, were sophisticated communication tools that saved countless lives. To understand why, you need to understand the communication challenges of World War II. Radio equipment in the early 1940s was heavy, unreliable, and required skilled operators. It was vulnerable to jamming, interception, and atmospheric conditions. A radio set powerful enough to communicate over significant distances weighed dozens of pounds and required regular maintenance. For small units operating behind enemy lines, for aircraft shot down in enemy territory, for ships in distress, radio wasn't always an option. Enter the pigeon. A healthy pigeon could carry a small message capsule dozens, even hundreds of miles, flying at speeds up to 60 miles per hour. They could fly in weather conditions that grounded aircraft. They couldn't be intercepted or jammed, and they possessed an innate homing instinct that we still don't completely understand. Release a pigeon anywhere within its range, and it will find its way home. The British established the National Pigeon Service, eventually enlisting over 200,000 birds. These weren't random street pigeons. These were carefully bred, trained racing birds, the product of generations of selective breeding. Their owners, often civilians, who'd spent decades developing their racing lofts, donated their best birds to the war effort. Stay with me, because the next story involves one pigeon's mission that reads like something from a thriller novel. Pigeons were dropped into occupied Europe as part of the intelligence-gathering operation called Columba. Small containers holding a pigeon, some food, a questionnaire, and instructions were parachuted into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The idea was simple. Resistance fighters or sympathetic civilians would find the containers, fill out the questionnaire with information about German military installations and movements, attach it to the pigeon, and release it back to England. It was an audacious plan, and it worked more often than it had any right to. Over 1,000 pigeons were dropped this way. Hundreds made it back with valuable intelligence. Some carried information about German V-weapon sites, those terrifying rocket facilities targeting London. Others brought details about troop movements, coastal defenses, and industrial targets, information that intelligence analysts could never have obtained any other way. But the Germans weren't stupid. They knew about the pigeons. They posted guards at suspected drop zones. They recruited hawks and falcons to hunt the birds. They made possession of a homing pigeon a crime punishable by death in occupied territories. The fact that the program continued to work despite these countermeasures speaks to both the courage of resistance workers and the remarkable abilities of the birds themselves. One pigeon, designated 42-WD1710, became legendary. The bird, later named Cologne, was dropped into occupied territory with a broken leg and wing damage from flak during the drop. Despite these injuries, after being found and loaded with intelligence by Dutch resistance fighters, the bird made it back across the North Sea to England, a flight of several hours in damaged condition. The information it carried was used to plan bombing raids that destroyed key German industrial targets. Another bird, William of Orange, flew over 250 miles from Arnhem to England during Operation Market Garden, carrying a message from surrounded British paratroopers. The message detailed their desperate situation and allowed Allied command to understand the true scope of the disaster unfolding. Though the paratroopers couldn't be saved, the intelligence prevented additional units from being thrown into the trap. Subscribe if you're learning things about World War II you never knew existed. Trust me, we're just getting started. Perhaps the most decorated pigeon of the war was an American bird named G.I. Joe. This pigeon saved the lives of at least 1,000 British soldiers in a single mission. The story goes like this. In October 1943, British forces captured the Italian village of Calvivecchia ahead of schedule. An American bombing raid was already scheduled to hit the village within hours. Radio communications had failed. There was no way to call off the bombers in time, except there was one way. G.I. Joe was released, carrying a desperate message to cancel the raid. The pigeon flew 20 miles in 20 minutes, arriving just as the bombers were preparing to take off. The raid was cancelled literally minutes before it would have devastated the village full of Allied troops. For this single mission, G.I. Joe received the Dickin Medal, the only American animal to be so honored during the war. The sheer number of messages carried by pigeons is staggering. In Normandy during D-Day and the subsequent campaign, pigeons carried thousands of messages. Aircraft crews carried pigeons specifically for emergency communication if they were shot down. When the HMS Formidable was bombed in the Mediterranean, pigeons carried messages about the ship's status and position, enabling rescue operations. But perhaps the strangest pigeon program never actually saw combat. I'm talking about Project Pigeon, later renamed Project Orcon, one of the most bizarre military research programs of the entire war. Behaviorist psychologist B.F. Skinner, famous for his work on operant conditioning, approached the military with an outlandish proposal. Pigeons could guide missiles to their targets. Before you laugh, understand that this was before any practical guided missile systems existed. The technology for electronic guidance was primitive, unreliable, and easily jammed. But pigeons, Skinner argued, could be trained to peck at an image of a target, and those pecks could control a missile's flight surfaces. Here's how it would work. A pigeon, or actually 3 pigeons for redundancy, would be placed in the nose cone of a missile. A lens system would project an image of what the missile was seeing onto a screen. The pigeons, trained extensively to recognize specific targets like ships or buildings, would peck at the image when they saw the target. Their pecks would be detected by sensors and translated into steering commands. Insane? Maybe, but Skinner actually got funding and managed to train pigeons to do exactly what he proposed. The birds could indeed recognize targets and respond appropriately, even under conditions simulating missile flight. The program was eventually cancelled, not because it didn't work, but because electronic systems advanced enough to make it unnecessary. But for a brief, surreal moment, the United States military seriously considered putting birds inside missiles. It tells you something about the era's military thinking regarding animals. They weren't seen as simple-minded beasts, they were problem-solving systems with capabilities that technology couldn't yet match. If a pigeon could do something a machine couldn't, then use the pigeon. The ethics could be sorted out later. Not every animal contribution involved direct combat. Mascots, for example, played a role that's easy to dismiss, but was actually psychologically vital. When you're 19 years old, far from home, facing death daily, small comforts become incredibly important. A dog sleeping in the barracks, a cat prowling around the camp, even a goat or a bird, these provided moments of normalcy in utterly abnormal circumstances. Wojtek the bear, yes, an actual brown bear, served with Polish forces in Italy. Found as a cub in Iran by Polish soldiers evacuating from the Soviet Union, Wojtek became an official soldier, complete with rank and paybook. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the war's bloodiest engagements, Wojtek carried ammunition boxes to artillery positions, working alongside human soldiers. He wasn't trained to do this, he simply observed what the soldiers were doing and, apparently deciding he wanted to help, started mimicking their actions. The psychological impact of Wojtek on his unit was immense. Here was this bear, calm under artillery fire, doing his part. If a bear could handle it, the men figured, so could they. After the war, Wojtek lived in Edinburgh Zoo, regularly visited by his former comrades. Those veterans would speak about the bear with a reverence, usually reserved for fallen heroes. Quick thing, if this documentary is keeping you engaged, hit subscribe. We put tremendous research into these stories, and your support means we can keep bringing you history's forgotten chapters. Ships often carried cats, not just as mascots, but for pest control. Rats aboard ships could devastate food supplies, chew through important equipment, and spread disease. Cats earned their passage. One cat, Unsinkable Sam, survived the sinking of 3 different warships, the German battleship Bismarck, the British destroyer HMS Cossack, and the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Probably just coincidence, but sailors being superstitious, Sam's reputation as both lucky and cursed followed him the rest of his life. Horses, despite mechanization, remained essential in many theaters. The German army, for all its reputation for mechanized blitzkrieg, actually relied on horses for the majority of its logistics. Over 2.5 million horses were used by German forces pulling supply wagons, artillery pieces, and ambulances. The Soviet Union used even more. In terrain where vehicles bogged down or couldn't obtain fuel, horses continued to work. In the mountains of Italy, where even horses struggled, mules became vital. American forces relied on thousands of mules to supply troops fighting in the Italian peaks. These animals carried ammunition, food, and medical supplies up narrow mountain trails, often under fire. Some mules made dozens of trips to forward positions, developing a kind of route memory where they could navigate paths in darkness or fog. In Burma and India, elephants performed labor that no other animal or machine could match. They moved through jungle terrain that would stop any vehicle. They could lift and carry loads that would require multiple pack animals. British, Indian, and later American forces relied on elephants for road construction, moving supplies, and even rescuing wounded soldiers from inaccessible areas. But elephants presented unique challenges. They're intelligent, emotional animals with complex social needs. Separating them from their herds caused distress. They formed strong bonds with their mahouts, the handlers who worked with them, and wouldn't always cooperate with strangers. Under artillery fire or bombing, elephants could panic, and a panicked elephant is extremely dangerous. Despite these challenges, elephant companies were formed and operated throughout the Burma campaign. They built bridges, cleared forests for airstrips, and transported supplies over terrain where everything else failed. Some elephants were even used to pull artillery pieces through the jungle, positioning guns in locations the Japanese never expected. The Japanese forces used elephants too, particularly in their own supply operations. Both sides learned to respect these massive animals, understanding that their cooperation was earned, not demanded. An elephant that decided it didn't want to work simply wouldn't work, and there was little anyone could do about it. We need to talk about the animals that served involuntarily in darker ways. Rats, for example, were never deliberately deployed as military assets, but they affected the war significantly. In the trenches, bunkers, and fortifications that characterized much of the conflict, rats thrived. They contaminated food supplies, spread disease, and inflicted psychological torment on soldiers who had to share living spaces with them. Some military researchers experimented with using rats as plague vectors, biological weapons that could be released in enemy territory. These programs, thankfully, never advanced beyond the experimental stage. The ethical implications were horrifying and the practical difficulties insurmountable, but the fact that such programs existed shows how far military thinking was willing to go. Insects played unintended roles too. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes killed more soldiers in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters than enemy action in some campaigns. Both sides tried to use this, draining swamps in their own areas while leaving enemy-held regions infested. It was biological warfare by environment, and it was devastatingly effective. But there's a twist to the insect story that's oddly heartwarming. Remember I mentioned glowworms earlier? During the trench warfare of World War I, soldiers discovered that certain bioluminescent insects, glowworms and similar species, produced enough light to read maps without giving away positions to enemy observers. This practice continued into World War II, particularly in the early years before reliable dim lighting solutions became available. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the fate of military animals became a question. Some, particularly in the American forces, were rehabilitated and returned to civilian life. The Dogs for Defense program eventually sent many canine corps dogs back to their original families or found them new homes. The transition wasn't always easy. Dogs trained to operate in combat zones sometimes struggled with civilian life. Handlers who'd formed intense bonds often had difficulty letting their partners go. Many animals, though, didn't survive to see peace. Casualty rates among animals could be staggeringly high, particularly for those serving in frontline roles. Messenger dogs faced the same dangers as human runners. Pigeons were shot down by enemy fire or fell prey to hawks. Horses and mules died from wounds, disease, and exhaustion. Elephants, despite their size, were vulnerable to artillery and bombing. The Soviet Union, facing economic devastation after the war, couldn't afford to maintain its military animals. Thousands were destroyed, deemed too expensive to feed, too dangerous to release, or too traumatized to be useful. It was a coldly practical decision that nonetheless represented a betrayal of animals that had served loyally. Here's something worth pausing for. How do we measure the value of their service? Estimates suggest that pigeons alone saved tens of thousands of lives by delivering messages that wouldn't have gotten through otherwise. Scout dogs prevented countless ambushes. Casualty dogs found wounded soldiers who would have died undiscovered. Even something as simple as a ship's cat preventing a rat infestation potentially saved lives by preserving food supplies and preventing disease. But there's a harder question underneath. Did these animals have a choice? Humans enlisted often voluntarily. Even conscripted soldiers understood on some level what they were fighting for. Animals had no such understanding. They served because humans trained them, placed them in situations where their instincts and conditioning compelled certain behaviors. This creates an ethical complexity that persists today. Modern military forces still use dogs, though in more limited and carefully controlled roles. Pigeons have been replaced by technology. Horses are ceremonial. But the fundamental question remains: is it ethical to use animals in warfare, knowing they can't comprehend the larger context, can't refuse, can't weigh the risks? Some argue that animals provided essential services that saved human lives, making their use justified. Others contend that conscripting creatures incapable of consent into humanity's conflicts is inherently wrong. There's no easy answer, and the debate continues in contexts like police dogs, explosive detection animals, and military working dogs today. Several memorials exist to honor animal service in World War II and other conflicts. The Animals in War Memorial in London's Hyde Park, unveiled in 2004, features inscriptions honoring all animals that served in British military conflicts. It depicts horses, dogs, and mules with an inscription reading, "They had no choice." Those three words capture the entire ethical dilemma. They served bravely, loyally, effectively. They saved lives and influenced battles, and they had no choice in any of it. The Dickin Medal, established in 1943 by Maria Dickin, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, specifically honors animal valor. 71 animals have received the medal since its creation, with 32 awarded during World War II. 18 dogs, 3 horses, and 1 cat were honored, but the majority, 32 birds, were pigeons. That distribution tells you something about which animals faced the most danger while providing the most critical service. Individual stories of decorated animals are remarkable. Rip, a mixed-breed terrier, found over 100 victims in London's rubble during the Blitz. Beauty, a wire-haired terrier, rescued 63 animals trapped in bombed buildings. Simon, the cat aboard HMS Amethyst, continued hunting rats while recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained during a Chinese artillery attack, maintaining crew morale during a tense standoff. Hit that like button if you think these stories deserve to be remembered alongside human accounts of the war. Judy, a purebred pointer, was the only animal officially registered as a prisoner of war. Serving aboard Royal Navy ships in the Far East, she survived the sinking of 2 vessels and spent time in Japanese POW camps where she boosted morale among imprisoned Allied soldiers. Her official POW status, granted by her captors after a prisoner shared his rations with her, was unique in military history. But for every decorated animal, thousands served without recognition. The horses that hauled supplies until they dropped from exhaustion, the dogs that died on their first mission, the pigeons shot down before completing their flights. Military record-keeping for animals was inconsistent at best. Many units didn't bother documenting animal casualties or contributions. The full scope of animal involvement will never be completely known. Why does any of this matter now, 8 decades after the war ended? Because these stories reveal something profound about both animals and ourselves. They demonstrate that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice are uniquely human traits. They show that intelligence and problem-solving exist across species in ways we're only beginning to understand, and they force us to confront difficult ethical questions about how we interact with other species. Modern military forces have learned from World War II's animal programs. Today's military working dogs receive extensive training, healthcare, and even retirement benefits. Efforts are made to reunite handlers with their dogs after service. The treatment of these animals has improved dramatically, reflecting evolving ethical standards. But we've also found technological replacements for many animal roles. Drones perform reconnaissance. Satellite communications are reliable and secure. Robots can clear explosives and enter dangerous environments. The military necessity for animal service has diminished in many areas, yet in some contexts, animals remain irreplaceable. A dog's nose is still more sensitive and discriminating than any electronic detector for certain substances. The bond between handler and dog creates a partnership that machines can't replicate. And in developing nations or resource-constrained environments, animals might still be the most practical solution for certain tasks. Think about this. Every person you've seen in a World War II documentary, every soldier in every photograph, might owe their survival to an animal they never met. That pigeon that delivered a message calling off an artillery barrage, that dog that alerted to an ambush on a jungle trail, that horse that pulled an ambulance to a field hospital. These acts rippled forward in time, preserving lives that went on to have children, grandchildren, entire family trees that exist because an animal performed its duty. This creates a strange kind of debt, one that's impossible to repay to creatures who didn't understand they were owed anything. The soldiers who worked directly with animals understood. The veterans who spoke about their dogs or the pigeons they released did so with a respect and affection that transcended species boundaries. They knew what they owed. World War II's animal programs teach us something about innovation under pressure. When faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, military forces looked beyond human capabilities, beyond existing technology, and found solutions in the natural world. Some of these solutions were elegant, others were ethically problematic, but all demonstrated a willingness to think creatively about problem-solving. Project Pigeon, ridiculous as it sounds, represented serious scientific inquiry into behavioral conditioning and its practical applications. The research contributed to our understanding of animal cognition and training techniques that have applications far beyond military contexts. Scout dog programs developed training methodologies that influence civilian dog training, search and rescue protocols, and eventually led to modern service dog programs that assist people with disabilities. The careful observation of canine behavior under stress, the refinement of training techniques, the understanding of handler-dog communication all emerged from military necessity. Pigeon breeding programs, while focused on producing birds for military use, also advanced our understanding of avian navigation, orientation, and cognition. Some of the most important research into how birds navigate used military pigeons as subjects. That research continues today, revealing the remarkable complexity of avian neurology. Before we wrap this up, make sure you're subscribed, because we're diving into more forgotten history that deserves attention. Even the failures taught lessons. The anti-tank dog program, in addition to its ethical problems, demonstrated the limitations of conditioning when confronted with novel stimuli. Dogs trained under certain conditions didn't reliably transfer that training to different contexts. This sounds obvious now, but it was an important learning moment for behaviorists and trainers. You can't simply program an animal like a machine. The larger lesson is about respect for animal intelligence and capabilities. These weren't automatons following simple commands. They were thinking, feeling creatures adapting to circumstances, problem-solving in real time, sometimes displaying initiative that surprised their handlers. The best military animal programs recognized this, working with the animal's nature rather than trying to completely override it. First-hand accounts from handlers reveal the emotional complexity of working with animals in combat. Many describe forming closer bonds with their dogs than with fellow soldiers. The dog was a constant companion, dependent and trusting in ways that create powerful emotional connections. When dogs were killed or lost, handlers grieved intensely. One American handler wrote about his dog being killed by a mine. The letter, preserved in archives, describes guilt and grief that rivals accounts of losing human comrades. He questioned whether he'd trained the dog properly, whether he'd given the right commands, whether the dog's death was his fault. This kind of emotional weight was carried by thousands of handlers. Pigeon handlers, meanwhile, developed deep knowledge of individual birds' capabilities and personalities. They could recognize birds by sight, knew which ones were reliable in bad weather, which ones were fastest, which ones had successfully completed the most missions. Releasing a pigeon was described by some as an act of faith, sending this small creature into danger and trusting it would survive and complete its task. Veterans who worked with elephants spoke about the animal's intelligence and memory. Elephants remembered handlers even after long separations. They distinguished between friendly and hostile humans. Some reportedly recognized the sounds of specific aircraft engines, responding differently to Allied versus Japanese planes. These observations, while anecdotal, suggest cognitive complexity that military planners were only beginning to appreciate. The institutional knowledge built up during the war largely dissipated afterward. Training programs were disbanded, specialized facilities closed. Handlers returned to civilian life, and their expertise went with them. Some knowledge was preserved in military manuals and training documents, but much was lost simply because no one thought to systematically record it. This represents a broader pattern in military history, where hard-won lessons are forgotten during peacetime, only to be relearned, painfully, in the next conflict. But with animal programs, the loss was particularly acute because the expertise was so specialized and the number of true experts so limited. Today, we're rediscovering some of that knowledge. Modern working dog programs have relearned many principles that World War II handlers understood. The use of animals in therapy and assistance roles draws on insights first developed in military contexts, but we're essentially reconstructing knowledge that once existed and was allowed to fade. There's a melancholy in that. The men and women who worked with these animals, who understood their capabilities intimately, who witnessed their courage and sacrifice, most are gone now. The last World War II veterans are in their late 90s or older. Soon there will be no one left who remembers directly. Which brings us to why we're here, why this documentary exists, why these stories matter. History isn't just about recording what happened. It's about understanding why it matters, what it reveals about us, what lessons it carries forward. The story of animals in World War II matters because it expands our understanding of the war itself, revealing dimensions of the conflict that are usually overlooked. It matters because it challenges us to think seriously about our relationship with other species, particularly when we ask them to serve our purposes. It matters because these were real creatures who suffered and died, and their sacrifice deserves acknowledgement even if they couldn't understand what they were sacrificing for. And frankly, it matters because some of these stories are just incredible. A bear carrying ammunition under fire, pigeons flying through conditions that grounded aircraft, dogs finding wounded soldiers against all odds. These embellished myths, they're documented facts that read like adventure novels. We owe it to the animals and to the handlers who worked with them to remember. Not with sentimentality, but with honesty about both the remarkable contributions and the ethical complexities. These animals were warriors, workers, and companions. They influenced battles, saved lives, and provided comfort in humanity's darkest hour. What does the future hold for animals in military service? Technology continues to replace biological capabilities in many areas. Drones perform reconnaissance without risk to animal life. Communication systems are vastly more reliable and secure than any pigeon. Mechanical vehicles traverse terrain that once required horses or elephants. But total replacement seems unlikely, at least in the near term. Dogs remain superior to machines for certain detection tasks. The partnership between human and animal creates capabilities that pure technology hasn't matched. As long as that remains true, animals will likely continue serving in some capacity. The question is how we serve them in return. Modern militaries are increasingly focused on animal welfare, understanding that well-treated animals perform better and that ethical treatment is simply right. Retirement programs, medical care, and attention to psychological well-being represent significant progress from World War II standards, but challenges remain. Deployments strain animals physically and psychologically. Separation from handlers causes distress. Combat exposure can traumatize animals just as it does humans, though their symptoms may manifest differently. The more we understand about animal cognition and emotion, the more apparent it becomes that military service exacts a serious toll. Share these stories. Comment with any family histories involving animals in wartime. These accounts need to be preserved. Private initiatives have emerged to support military animals and their handlers. Organizations work to reunite handlers with dogs after service. Others provide medical care for retired military animals. Some focus on ensuring animals aren't simply disposed of when their service ends. These efforts, while valuable, are scattered and underfunded, suggesting society hasn't fully grappled with its obligations to these animals. In some countries, military animals receive honors and recognition approaching that given to human veterans. In others, they remain largely invisible, their service unacknowledged. The disparity reflects broader cultural attitudes about animals and their moral status. As those attitudes continue evolving, treatment of military animals will likely continue improving. It's easy to get lost in statistics, hundreds of thousands of pigeons, millions of horses, thousands of dogs. These numbers convey scale but lose the individual. Every number was a living creature with its own experiences, its own suffering or triumph, its own story. That pigeon that saved British troops at WWII wasn't just an asset, a data point in operational history. It was an individual bird that flew through fear and exhaustion to deliver a message. That dog that found a wounded soldier wasn't performing an abstract function. It was experiencing the confusion and horror of the battlefield, pushing through that to complete its task. We can honor both the collective contribution and the individual sacrifices. The pigeons collectively formed a communication network that influenced the war's outcome, but G.I. Joe individually saved specific lives in a specific place at a specific moment. Both truths matter. Similarly, handlers weren't just managing assets, they were forming relationships, caring for individual animals they knew by name and temperament. When veterans spoke about their animals, they didn't cite statistics, they told stories about specific dogs, specific moments, specific bonds. This tension between the individual and the collective defines much of war history. Strategic narratives talk about divisions, corps, armies. Personal narratives talk about friends, experiences, moments of terror or courage. Animal stories occupy both spaces simultaneously, operating at the strategic level while remaining intensely personal for those directly involved. When we forget these stories, we lose more than interesting historical footnotes. We lose context for understanding how wars are actually fought, the full range of resources and capabilities militaries deploy. We lose appreciation for the complexity of logistics and communications in pre-digital eras. We lose ethical perspectives on how societies mobilize every available resource during total war. Students learning about World War II often come away with a mechanistic understanding. Tanks fought tanks, planes fought planes, ships fought ships. The reality was vastly more complex. Success depended on supply chains, intelligence, communications, morale, and hundreds of other factors. Animals contributed significantly to many of these factors. Leaving them out of the narrative creates a distorted picture. Teachers and documentarians have a responsibility to present fuller accounts. Not to glorify animal use in warfare, but to honestly represent what happened and invite ethical reflection. Young people particularly need to understand that technological warfare didn't eliminate biological components, that living creatures remained central to military operations well into the 20th century. There's also something lost when we fail to acknowledge the emotional dimensions of war. The soldiers who worked with animals experienced war differently than those who didn't. They had responsibilities for lives beyond their own. They formed attachments that provided comfort and purpose. When we erase animal stories, we erase part of the human experience of war. We've traveled through terrain that most World War II histories ignore. We've met pigeons who flew through fire, dogs who braved no man's land, elephants who hauled supplies through impossible jungles, and even a bear who carried ammunition. We've confronted uncomfortable ethical questions about using animals who couldn't consent or understand. We've seen both the nobility of animal service and the tragedy of their sacrifice. What should we take from all this? Perhaps that courage exists across species. That loyalty and dedication aren't uniquely human. That in our darkest moments, we've relied on creatures who ask nothing in return except basic care and kindness. That our relationship with animals is more complex, more profound, and more ethically challenging than we often acknowledge. The animals of World War II were warriors without choice, heroes without recognition, casualties without remembrance. But they were there, in the skies above Europe, on the beaches of Normandy, in the jungles of Burma, on the seas of the Pacific. They served alongside millions of humans, and their contributions shaped outcomes that affect us still. We can't give them back their lives. We can't retroactively grant them the choice they never had. But we can remember, we can honor their service honestly, acknowledging both the remarkable contributions and the ethical complexities. We can tell their stories to ensure they don't fade completely from memory. Because ultimately, history belongs to everyone who lived through it, who shaped it, who suffered in it. And that includes a pigeon named G.I. Joe, a dog named Rob, a bear named Wojtek, and hundreds of thousands of other creatures whose names we'll never know but whose service deserves acknowledgement. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, thank you. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future deep dives into forgotten history. Share this with anyone who might appreciate learning about these incredible animals. Comment with your thoughts on the ethics of animal service or any family stories about animals in wartime. These conversations matter, these memories matter, and ensuring they survive into future generations is work we all share. The animals of World War II can't speak for themselves, but their handlers spoke for them, their actions spoke for them, and now their stories speak for them. We just need to listen, to remember, and to honor the debt we can never fully repay. They fought, they bled, they died, and they had no choice. But we have a choice, the choice to remember, to honor, and to ensure their sacrifice means something beyond the immediate military objectives they served. That's the least we can do for the forgotten warriors who helped win the most devastating war in human history.